Thank you for downloading Atypical, the podcast. If you enjoy our work, all we ask is that you leave us a review in your podcast player and share it with your friends. It helps us reach more people, and it's always great to hear from you. Thank you again, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Atypical, the podcast.
I've never actually watched a Tom Scott video.
Yeah, I was surprised, impressed. You literally host a neurodiversity podcast.
do I have to hand back my autism card now?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Tom Scott, if ever you listen to this, which is highly unlikely, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, but I do get the thing of being like first of all, you should. They're fantastic videos. But also, I do get the thing of like, I have this impressive track record of never having seen one, and I don't want to ruin it.
Yeah.
So I can see how you've backed yourself into a bit of a corner there.
Hello and welcome to Atypical, the podcast where we look at life from a more atypical perspective. My name's Simon Heather, your host, and I'm joined today by an amazing, wonderful, and brilliant person and lovely friend.
Hello, everyone. My name's Georgia Harper. Pronouns she, her.
Yeah, brilliant, and I'm so very, very pleased to have you on. We've been talking about this on and off for nearly a year, I think.
Ages. Yeah, it's taken forever. Sorry.
For all the right reasons, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we're recording this on Tuesday the 18th, which is Autistic Pride Day, albeit that this will come out on Friday, because bear in mind, listener, that we do record these in the past. So I'm very much looking forward to the episode we do the day before the election, where I can probably try and wind somebody up with that. I might try and get Dave on for that one. That might be quite funny.
I feel like what happens there, it'll be an interesting one to listen back on.
I think that could be funny. So Dave, tell me, who won in Kanye West? That's a constituency, isn't it? No?
I mean, it probably is. I don't know all of them.
Anyway, so Autistic Pride. You're a bit more of an expert on this stuff than I am. So, what is autism?
Good question. So I would say autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, neurotype way of thinking, kind of. Depends how you want to frame it, really. That it is a way of seeing and interacting with the world. There are a range of traits autistic people tend to have around social things, sensory things, executive functioning things, and all that, which I probably don't need to list here.
No.
But everyone is very different, so it's quite hard to, quite hard to pin down, really.
Yeah, it's one of the things we often say, isn't it? Is if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think one of the nice things we've talked about it before is different ways in which people talk about it. You've obviously mentioned the common definition, which is the neurodevelopmental condition about perception, socialization, and communication. I think those are
something like that. Yeah. There's a few different. I think that's.
There's also repetitive behaviors and.
I've seen it defined as kind of, like restricted repetitive behaviors and quote unquote marked deficits in social communication.
You've been reading the DSM again, haven't you?
A lot of the. I mean, we talked about this fairly recently, but while our understanding as a society of autism and neurodiversity has moved on, like the clinical diagnostic criteria, if you look at them, even the more recent ones, the DSM-5 and the ICD-11 in the UK, it's still very, very like deficit based.
Yeah.
So I guess if you want to boil down, technical definitions of autism, it gets ugly quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's this was something we found recently, wasn't it, in the Oxford Clinical Dictionary?
Yes.
What was it, mental disorders or
psychiatric? Yes, like psychiatric. I think it was
the most up to date Oxford handbook, and it only really talked about autism in children. I think one paragraph about adults.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And things like, I guess, the overlap. It's not something I know tons about, but the overlap between ADHD and autism. Basically,
so
the the way the diagnostic criteria were before, like, the latest round of revisions, essentially, so last 10 years, like, basically it was often the case that if you were diagnosed with one, you could not be diagnosed with the other. And actually, when I got my autism diagnosis, which was 2003, I want to say, I was actually told that ADHD was on the autism spectrum. So, like, my diagnosis was Asperger's, and they were kind of like, well, this is on the autism spectrum, or you could have ADHD, which is on the autism spectrum, or you could have I'm kind of went through the other labels, which is, weirdly, I guess if we're talking about neurodiversity more broadly, they're almost so wrong that we've circled background, and now we're thinking about it in that way again, but not quite in the way they intended. So, like, that particular co-occurrence, which we now know is massive,
between 50 and 70% of people with ASD present, at least with the comorbidity, I suppose, of that ADHD stuff. I mean, it's a huge, huge number. If you think, if you've got more than 1 in 2 chance, if you're autistic, of having ADHD, that does suggest a certain underlying connection, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot we don't know. I guess what I would say as well is that, these kind of diagnostic criteria are kind of to make researchers and medical professionals' lives easier. And real life brains won't always fit this, the exact boxes that we've made for them. Generally, if you are neurodivergent, you're more likely to be neurodivergent in more than one way.
Yep.
And that can mean, meeting criteria for 2 or more separate diagnoses. But there are also quite a lot of us who are like a little from A, a little from B.
I'll have a bucket of the difficulty with certain types of seafood and a little bit of the imposter syndrome. But you know what? Hold back on the inability to talk to people part of it, because I wish it was as easy as that. So pick and choose.
No, I don't. Yeah, it's it's more like a potluck. But like, I've only got the one diagnosis. I used to run. Obviously, I should say I work for an awesome charity, Autistica, and in my previous
the best
role,
autism charity.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, no, that's why I said it,
because
well, so am I, because I've read the stuff that's come out of various of them, and yours is the clearest. So,
but in my previous role, still at Autistica, I used to run the Neurodiversity Coalition, Embracing Complexity, which was kind of about all of this, the overlap. I say was because that was my job. It is still going. It's being run by somebody else who's doing a much better job of it. So that's all still up. But it was a weird job to have while I was sat here with my one solitary diagnosis that I've got, being like, if you're neurodivergent, you're probably neurodivergent in more than one way, looking over my shoulder, what's coming for me? And I think I don't, I identify as autistic, obviously. Never really identified with any of the other things in the umbrella. But I can also see, like, okay, as you say, like, that one trait from there that wouldn't warrant a full diagnosis, and that one trait from there. And there are a few people who actually don't meet criteria for any diagnosis, but
absolutely.
You have a bit of a, I'll have one of everything, please. And
it's just slightly toned down sometimes. Yeah, I always find that incredible, because I mean, that again for me is the whole part of being a spectrum. Is sort of it's not a scale.
Absolutely.
Again, our friend Mysterious Voice has a rant about scales versus spectra. One day he shall return. But what I found really interesting was the latest meta-analysis, which I was reading on this just the other day, because I do love a good paper. I think that's my special interest, is reading scientific papers about neurodiversity and then criticizing them. I don't know where I picked this particular one up. I can also read legislation. It's a very much an unuseful thing in project world, but there you go.
I mean, I feel like if you were in my line of work, that would be perfect.
Oh well, I mean,
papers.
It is. It's very helpful for my various weird and wonderful connections with sort of European institutions, but.
And here I am with a special interest in transport, but I'm here doing this job.
And I don't really like transport that much. Should we swap jobs? I don't know the difference between a 455 and a 710, apart from the fact that one has air conditioning. I couldn't tell you which one it is without being honest.
I mean, same. But yeah, that would be a hell of a sitcom. Neurodivergent job swap. Sorry, carry on.
No, I'm now just I'm working out how we can pitch this to Channel 4. Anyway, no, see, this is the problem when you have neurodivergent people. We do like to jump around the subject a bit, don't we? But anyway, so I was reading the most recent meta-analysis, which is obviously where they look at lots of different pieces of data and draw it all together. This is the wonderful thing. Reported rates of comorbidity range from 10 to 90%. I mean, that is a range.
Yeah, they're basically some people. And just to clarify, we're still talking about autism and ADHD here.
Yes.
Yeah. No, there's I
mean, because there's OCDs in there. There's tic syndrome. There's
dyspraxia, this is neurodivergence in general. Yeah.
Well, no, this is just ADHD and ASD.
Yeah.
And once you start throwing in things like dyslexia, which is about 10% of the normal population anyway, you start seeing all these things. I mean, I've talked about this before. As I knew about the dyslexia and the hyperactivity from about age 3 or 4. I didn't know about the autism until only a few years ago. And so I'm kind of the mirror opposite of you, is that I went and had my ADHD diagnosis. And then they're like, oh, you should probably get an autism diagnosis because you're also autistic. It's like, really? Okay.
And then did you have to sit on a years-long waiting list for someone to confirm?
Let's just say that I have the I don't necessarily feel shame autism, whereby I bother people until things get done.
I mean, valid.
Yeah, a weekly letter or email or telephone call to the doctors responsible for it and reminding them things like the NHS 18 week sort of thing.
Dedication.
It cost me a bit in stamps, but I'll tell you what, I did get seen inside 18 weeks. Only just. Partly that was a little bit my fault, and that's where the ADHD thing came in, is that they sent me some forms to fill out, and then I ADHD'd them away for 2 weeks because it was about 76 pages asking me about what I was like as a child. And I'm going, I'm in my 30s. Everything that happened to me under about the age of 16, I don't want to remember because bullying was a thing at school. And it's
I mean, I got diagnosed quite young. I was 9 years old, but long story short, the bureaucracy, the bad medical record keeping, etc. I had to do an assessment when I was doing my master's, so I was about 23. And to be fair, it was relatively quick. Can't fault the team that did it. Yeah, I got a questionnaire, and it was basically for my parent. And we know that it's something that we hear as a huge barrier because, for example, if you're an older adult and your parents have died, then it's quite difficult because you're not in contact with your parents and so on. But anyway, I was living in London at the time, and I basically did this questionnaire with my mum over Skype. I sort of read her the questions, and she kind of directed me. But even for her, it was like, we're going back a bit to me being 18 months old and learning to walk and all of that. Like,
it's you kind of think, one, is there anybody who even remembers that? But two, why are we still basing this criteria on what you were like as a child? It might give a bit of an insight, sure, but once you get a certain distance away, you then start thinking about, well, what have they learned? What have they changed? And I think this is probably a good place to segue into what the theme of this year's Autism Pride Day is, which is masking, that camouflaging, and what that means. But before we do quickly go into that, I because I was thinking about the definition, I've just double checked what it says on the NHS website about autism, and I'm kind of pleased that they've moved away from that definition directly on their front page. And one of the very first headings is autism is not an illness.
That's something.
It's something because it's really not an illness. We don't need to be cured.
Yeah, I think it's good to see some of that. I think there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect, and it's not necessarily the fault of the NHS or any of the professionals. This is more of an international thing, but you get these people who are very understanding and are very accepting and do have a very, I guess, up-to-date view of autism. But in terms of being able to put a tick in the box, it's, they're kind of constrained by the criteria we have.
Yeah.
And that's, we could talk about that all day because I'd love to
We
have magic answers. But
oh
things are clearly
crumbs.
quite broken.
Yes. Let's cover that another time. But yes, so the masking thing is kind of a really interesting one. It's one I've talked about on here before, and fundamentally, it's. I mean, we all know. I hope we all know what masking is. It's sort of that, especially autistic masking, whereby I guess we are. What's the right way of putting this? What's a polite way of putting it? Suppressing our, I suppose, basic natural autistic behaviors, our traits, in order to fit in and be more accepted. Would you say that's a reasonable?
Yeah, I guess suppressing fate, suppressing stress. Sometimes it's more of a proactive, like, almost rote learning how to be normal, for want of a better phrase,
Yeah,
and
it was for me.
learning from media and then just trying to keep that up as almost like a role play. It does really depend. I guess masking is it's really an umbrella term for
Hmm.
a
Not fully
wide range of
presenting.
yeah, a wide range of things. And
And
in many people, it can become unconscious as well.
yes, oh,
Like,
absolutely.
yeah,
Years of people beating it into me that I should try and shake hands when I meet people, and sometimes I do it, and then I catch myself and doing, why am I doing this? I don't. Why do I want to touch people? No, no, thank you. Have they not heard of COVID? Yeah, I think for me, there's a huge issue around the fact that it's fundamentally, I guess, a response to negative, or as this paper puts it, stigmatizing ways in
hmm
which I guess society still views autism. Some of us, me, I certainly know, and lots of our friends sort of feel that pressure, I suppose, to mask
absolutely.
to avoid that judgment, to avoid that bullying in the schoolyard, or
Mhm.
to avoid discrimination. I know that, for example, lots of studies suggest that one of the reasons we have an underrepresentative number of women being diagnosed is because that they are better at masking. I'm still unsure about the science methodology behind that, but there are a number of studies that seem to suggest that, along with obviously all the things of no, autism is for 7-year-old boys who like trains.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I guess in terms of underdiagnosis of women and girls, there are, as you say, a large a large number of factors.
Mm,
I worry sometimes that we oversimplify it by talking only about masking.
yes,
Not least because it kind of implies that men don't mask, which is not strictly
patently
true.
untrue. Yes.
Yes. And there is a study I've read. I believe it was Lily Levy and team
Oh yes.
a few years ago, where essentially in their sample, and I'll be honest, I can't remember exactly what the sample size was and so on, but in their sample, people of all genders were about as likely as each other to exhibit masking behaviors.
Mm.
Women were significantly more likely to be disbelieved as being autistic on that basis, which is
Oh
which is
right.
interesting. But yeah, no, it's really and I guess there's an argument around, like, as women, as girls, we perhaps face particular pressures from an earlier age to
Mm.
fit a narrower box. And yeah, it's really interesting, but yeah,
And I
masking
think.
certainly isn't limited to women by
Oh
any
no,
means.
absolutely not. No, I mean
Yeah.
everybody, whoever you are, whatever your gender identity is,
Mhm,
I think it's not necessarily something that's sticks to just one particular people. It's
mhm,
I always find that an interesting, I suppose, excuse. I'm not even going to say argument. I think it's an excuse.
mhm.
But part of me wonders if it's just down to the fact that because autism is still, as we just talked about, sort of portrayed as a disorder or the deficit word,
Mhm.
rather than just, I guess, the different way of being, in that sort of myth-normality way. Uh, people internalize that stigma, and
Yeah,
so we
I
we try and hide our traits because even though masking takes that huge mental effort, I mean, I'm certain that I burnt out from it more than once. Mental health issues and so forth. We're doing it because we're afraid, I suppose.
I guess, like, as well, there are really awful attitudes out there, obviously, around autism and autistic people. There is also, I think, a lot of stigma around particular autistic traits and
Mm,
in general, just like violation of social norms, however arbitrary, and things like that.
yes.
So growing up, we get quite a lot of negative feedback from people who have not necessarily woken up and gone, I hate autistic people. I'm going to be mean to autistic people today. But in practice, if you are judged or mocked or ostracized for moving in a particular way or speaking in a particular way, you're gonna learn to try and hide that quite quickly. And that, of course, applies whether you have an autism diagnosis or whether you don't realize you're autistic. So that's thinking about the kind of work we have to do in terms of tackling attitudes.
Yes.
A really important part of that is there are people, in fact, I think, a lot of people, I think this is internalized in a lot of us, perhaps including neurodivergent people.
I think
There are
especially.
people there are people who know the right things to say in terms of, yes, I'm not waking up thinking, how can I be mean to autistic people today? But who would, know the right things to say in a sort of attitude poll,
Yes.
but who in practice will judge people.
Those who
Implicitly,
stray from the
explicitly.
norm.
Yeah, and that's really hard to capture. Like you can't. Yeah.
It's looking at it in that sort of social context and those pressures that lead not just autistic people, but I think lots of other people to mask in the first place. What is the understanding, I guess, the trauma that might have led someone to that? Looking
I
at those
saw,
intersections, perhaps with
yeah.
your gender identity or your race or other co-occurring, I think is
In terms of looking kind of, I guess, beyond autism, there's probably a fair amount of overlap. I
Oh, yeah.
saw this Instagram post the other
Oh,
day
no.
that fascinated me. And it was, I say an Instagram post, it was the thing where there are only 3 websites and they're all screenshots of each other. So it was the Very British Problems Instagram, and it was just like it was just a screenshot of their tweet. And I can't remember the wording, but it was basically the gist of it was that making small talk and having to say, I can't believe it's this chilly in June, when will summer turn up? But thinking, actually, I really like like drinking tea and being able to sleep at night, or something, something similarly like Very British Problems-y
Yes.
worded. Then all of the comments were like, yeah, I get this. I've just had this conversation where I've been like, when summer coming back, but I secretly am relieved and I hate summer. And it's just like it fascinated me because
Is Britain autism coded?
well, it's just like, I for context for everyone else, my deep-seated vendetta with summer goes back a long time, and part of the reason it's been so chilly is just that, like, I've been ill, so I haven't been out, so the sun hasn't had to antagonize me personally. And but this is really like, I genuinely was just looking through it, being like, hang on, is part of what's going on here just that I didn't realize we were meant to lie? And why are we all lying? Because I think it's kind of okay for people to have different preferences and opinions on the weather. Like, that's fine. None of us can change it anyway. It's not like all the winter people are gonna like rise up and overthrow the sun. Like, it just and it just
start worshipping.
It just fascinated me because perhaps some of these people are masking. Perhaps this is a part of it, and this is you have to say the things that are expected. But there are
Isn't weather
also
masking just wearing a hat?
but there are also like a lot of people in there who are neurotypical, but who have clearly got this thing of
They've
I have to
internalized the
play.
stigma of not liking summer.
Or like I have to, well, it's not so much that, well, it's that, but also it's like, and I have to play this really weird social game about it, which
Yes.
I have an understanding of and I'm able to do. And like, this is a relatively benign topic as well. So like, it just made me think about, bringing this back into masking. It just made me think about the sheer weight of like random arbitrary social norms, like not the stuff that has a purpose because it might harm someone if you do something, like the really arbitrary stuff, and how a lot of people are kind of just pretending, and it's just like there's got to be a better way, surely.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to come out here and say I actually quite like summer and warm weather.
You're allowed to.
I grew up in the tropics, so for me, like sort of 30 degrees is quite pleasant. I realise that in Britain our houses are really not designed for that, and given that
No.
the whole of Britain is north of the sort of the contiguous 48 states of the US, and so they're looking at us and going, "Hang on a minute, you're saying it's above 72 degrees and you're getting hot." It's like, yes, because it shouldn't be that hot here. So I do get it. I do get why people are anti-summer, but I mean, I'm not. I'm all for it.
You're allowed to be pro summer.
You are.
And
Oh,
I'm
thank you.
very sorry it hasn't turned up.
It's fine. I'll survive. I can get on a train and go to Europe. Probably, maybe. But the masking thing, I think that so I was talking about this at work,
Mhm.
and I have some friends and colleagues in various organizations, and one person I was talking to who works for a consultancy was
Mhm.
brought in to do some work on masking in the workplace. And they shared the results of their study with me. They went and spoke to half a dozen different companies, and they split people up into three groups. So they looked at the experiences of autistic people, they looked at the experiences of people with other neurodivergences,
Mhm.
so ADHD and dyslexia, etc., and neurotypical people, or sort of holistic people, I suppose.
Mhm.
Those who don't neither have a diagnosis nor particularly look like they should probably be banging down the door to their GP. And they were looking at this whole sort of thing about masking in the workplace, and they found that actually it's incredibly common across all three groups. So to
Mhm.
go back to your point there, is it's not just autistic people who do it. I think everybody masks to a certain extent.
We
Uh,
found quite similar in Autisticas their
yeah, there
research
you
as
go.
well. Yeah. So I can't remember the exact figures. I think it was something that was more common in neurodivergent people, but
Yes.
still pretty common in neurotypical
Yeah.
people.
But
Yeah.
so this is the thing. So she was telling me about this and saying that it looked like lots of people masked to fit in socially with colleagues.
Mhm.
I don't know. They try and find out what happened at the football. So if somebody says, "Oh, did you see that match last night?" Not referencing any particular television programs there, but we often mask to avoid those negative judgments, perhaps to improve your chances of getting promoted. And whilst it happened across all three of those groups, she said that specifically autistic and just wider neurodivergent people reported that they felt extra pressure to mask because of a lack of understanding about neurodiversity in most workplaces. And I think that's why days like today, sort of Autism Pride Day, or 3 days ago when you listen to this episode, are really important about raising awareness and the kinds of campaigning that, like you do, for example, on why it's important to understand it.
I guess, yeah. I On the workplace masking thing, the motivations thing is really interesting because, again, in terms of the paper that I'm thinking of, it was kind of neurotypical people mask to fit in socially, maybe to better earn their chances of a promotion or some kind of better outcome. Autistic and neurodivergent people may be more likely to mask to not get fired
Yep.
and to not be bullied and ostracized. So it's something that is very commonplace, but it's almost like the stakes are higher, for neurodivergent people. And yeah, I also think that, like, I'm thinking about my experiences in the workplace here, but also in general, the more we accept neurodiversity and different ways of being and, adjustments and flexibility and all of
Hmm.
that,
Yep.
that is good for neurotypical people as well.
Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
that's good
Yes.
for, it's good for everyone to be breaking down these stigmas.
And just as a quick one here, that was part of our driving force behind the PAS 6064, the design for the mind. Was the
Woo!
one of the driving things behind that documentation. And for those listeners who don't know what the hell I'm talking about, it's a public standard effectively for architects to follow in the UK, that about building new buildings to be more friendly to people with different cognitive requirements. So that's, making you think about the lighting and the thermal comfort and colors and textures and ways of people finding their way around. And I think one of the first buildings in the UK to adopt this actually is the headquarters of the RNIB,
Yes,
the Royal National
very
Institute of the Blind.
exciting. Yeah.
It's a really, really lovely building, and it's
Have
been
you
very well
been?
laid out, primarily obviously for people who've got failing sight, but for all of their staff, including a whole bunch of their staff who are very much neurotypical, they're saying it's great because some of us have migrated to the side of the building that gets sunshine, and some of us have gone to the bit that's cooler, and some have gone to the bit that's warmer. Some people have gone to the area that's got carpeting, and some have gone to the wooden floors. And so it means you can get the sounds, you can get the textures, you can get the lighting that suit you in the right part of the building.
What I really like about PAS 6463 is rather than kind of, it's supposed to be pan neurodiversity, well, not even pan neurodiversity, pan, everyone. And
Exactly. And that was the driving factor behind it was
rather than, I think a lot of kind of sensory guides, there's sort of a bit of a stereotyped version of autism friendly that actually is two different autistic people could have completely opposite
Oh yeah.
needs,
Yep.
and it was something that we really liked. But for context, we were both at electromagnetic fields a few weeks ago,
Fantastic
and
event.
I was watching Simon's talk on on neurodiversity and the myth of normality and so on, and he mentioned his involvement in PAS 6463, and instinctively I cheered before kind of realizing that. And this was a very like neurodivergent heavy
Yeah,
crowd, as we knew
it
from
really
like
was,
earlier
wasn't it? Yeah.
comments. Yeah. And I looked around and I realized, oh, hang on, I'm the only other nerd here that knows what that is.
But
Because we also fed into it. But yeah.
I was on the edge of a mild panic at that point because I as you could tell I'd forgotten where I was in my notes, and so that little cheer really helped me. So thank you for that. I was like, oh, good,
I'm
somebody
glad.
is enjoying what I'm saying. Now then, where was I? The 1800s. It was.
Oh, look, my one of my favorite parts in the whole talk was the bit where you were kind of like, "Oh, I'm not doing that bit because I've used the word avant-garde." No further I have no further context. So, yeah, perfect.
Oh God, yes, I'd forgotten that bit. Now I'm feeling like I have to start asking to avoid all the negative judgments people are going to give me for using avant-garde.
No,
uh,
you were the one negatively judging yourself. I don't know. I
But this
don't
is
know
true.
how
So
you could use it.
I mask different bits of my brain from myself. It's much safer that way. But
Mood.
having said that, actually, I try not to mask at work because it is incredibly exhausting and stressful.
Mhm.
It makes people constantly worry about whether your mask is good enough. And I've had this conversation with other friends who I work with and in other companies and so forth. And sometimes they're almost having a panic, thinking, "Am I masking well enough?" And then they end up having a meltdown because they're not sure if they're masking well enough. It's like, no,
God,
you were
yeah.
fine, but you get into
No,
that sort of cycle.
like particularly at work, and it's been a while, thankfully, but like a good 90% of my meltdowns are ultimately caused by being anxious about the possibility that I might have a meltdown.
Yeah.
Which is really
Self-fulfilling
helpful,
prophecy at that point.
thankfully. Yeah. Yeah, I guess, you know, I'm quite lucky really with where I work. We're a small team, about 20-ish people, so we all know each other. We are a very neurodiverse team in general, and I've learned a lot about, as an autistic person, I've learned a lot about autism and neurodiversity through working where I do because, as we were just saying, people can have opposite needs to me, completely different strengths and needs. And I think that has helped me to appreciate my own strength and others as well, and including neurotypical people. Again, if you can just pick up a phone and make a phone call, then I think you have a superpower. And
I can do
that's
that.
cool, amazing, and you're pro summer, amazing. You're invincible.
Well, I don't know about that because
I,
I do need to sort of then go and get myself a cup of tea afterwards and go, oh my God. But
yeah.
I did spend a bit of time working in a call center. I think that may have broken me.
Wow.
So the inability to deal with
I
sort
mean,
of
I used to
emergency
work.
calls would have been
Yeah.
terrible. But
I mean, I used to work in a library,
oh,
and
the
we would
dream
get.
job.
Yeah, it was brilliant. But we did get phone calls abound, and I would deal with that. And I think what was okay about it was that it was kind of all the same things. Like if somebody wanted to renew some books or to look up when a book was due, like there was a process for doing that. And I'd probably already had 5 other conversations that day that were exactly the same, in a way that many phone calls on that are not work are not that.
Yeah.
And I can see, I don't have call center experience, but I can sort of see how it might be similar in that a lot of the call, there's probably only a few different ways the conversation can go.
Oh yeah, no, it was very much a case of I didn't have to worry about small talk. It was straight
Yeah.
into the, what is going on kind of thing, which is easy enough to do because you can sort of then bypass the do I have to spend 5 minutes talking about the weather with them? Because we're obviously not going to see eye to eye on this. And being able just then to get on with the job in front of me. And I think that was quite helpful. But just the last thing I was thinking about in terms of the sort of the masking in the workplace thing is about I think one of the ways in which we can change it, because obviously we have that terrible statistic of something like only 21.7% of autistic people are in full-time work or education, which is an astonishing number and not in a good way. And I think part of how we can improve that is by making workplaces more inclusive and accepting of neurodiversity. So one of the things that I've been trying to do in my workplace is get more training for managers, line managers. I think some of the stuff that is currently happening in quite a few companies and industries now is starting to look towards more practical support and accommodations. And it'll take what a time, it always does, but shifting that kind of workplace culture
Absolutely.
and challenging things like the one of my favorite ones, it's a slide I use whenever I'm talking to people about neurodiversity, is the invisible rules of the workplace, and stating things clearly. So there's a picture I have where someone's put a sign next to a toaster saying toaster must be watched at all times. Does that mean I have to stand here for
You're
my entire
hiring a
day making
toast
sure it doesn't run
hiring a
away?
toaster guard.
Does it set fire to things if I turn my back on it? What's going on? Is this toaster going to turn?
Yeah,
If I get
it took me a good little while, even as you said that, for me to work out that the toaster has to be watched when it's in active use
Yeah.
by the person who has just put the toast in. But if you're new, yeah, it's
do I when I get up to make a cup of tea, do I have to offer one to everyone else in the team?
Mm.
And so for me, a lot of what I do when I get sort of managers come to me and go, "Oh, I'm worried. I've got this person joining my team, and apparently they might be autistic. How do I deal with them?" And I sort of give them a slightly pitying look and go, "Well, you've just managed to talk to me, so you can talk to autistic people. They're not three-headed aliens, I promise. Well, unless they're into cosplay. But it's like, just be open and clear and just say what it is. Have a conversation with someone and say, how do you want to be communicated with? Because I've got a colleague who struggles with sound and struggles with taking in verbal communication, so spends about 90% of their time wearing noise cancelling headphones. But if you send him a well-written, clear email saying, this is what we need, you're going to get some of the best work you will get out of anyone else in the team, because that's how they best communicate.
Yeah, I think a lot
It's
of
just
it
small
is
accommodations.
yeah, a lot of it is just flexibility.
Yeah.
Like, you don't necessarily have to be an expert on autism, just kind of have to be able to listen. And, I've been quite lucky, but a lot of the things I've needed over the years at work have not been particularly formal. It's things like being able to wear headphones and not being judged for it. Like, as you say, some of the unwritten rules and, having some of those things a bit more clearly explained. Being able to work from home when I've needed to. Just having the understanding sometimes that
Yeah.
I might find certain things difficult. I might be having a bit of a difficult day. And I guess, like, thinking about masking, I think sometimes we can have trying to be normal so ingrained that, like, things that basically are normal, we might be nervous about things that
Mm.
basically are normal. I mean, the example I've got in my head, and I'm thinking back to our old office. This was pre-COVID. Was pretty tiny. We're
Mm.
not there anymore because we outgrew it.
Great.
I used to have this little USB fan thing,
Mm.
and again, not particularly abnormal in
No, not
hindsight,
at all.
but I was so nervous about, like, because they make a noise. So I was like, oh God, is this disturbing everyone? Is this drawing loads of attention to me? The last thing I need right now is to have loads of attention drawn to me. And I used to sit kind of on the end of my row of desks, but there was another desk kind of that was like at a right angle to me. And during this time, there were two different colleagues who, at different points, that was their desk, and both of them separate. I'm not sure they even overlapped. So, like, both of them separately, I messaged them once and was just like, "Hey, is this fan bothering you?"
Hmm.
And both of them replied with some variation of, "Wait, what fan?" Um, and it's just one of those things that I look back on, things that are non that a neurotypical person might not even think of as being a sensory thing or an autism thing. To a neurodivergent person, that masking instinct might still be pretty ingrained. And yeah, it's it's I
I
think
think
I'm really lucky with where I am, but it's definitely been a bit of a learning curve, kind of not, you know, trying to mask less essentially, and it's certainly not something that I'm perfect at right now.
it's actually quite hard to do, isn't it? Because it becomes as automatic as breathing sometimes.
Yeah, and
I
then
know
and then
people
you
who.
get the thing of like, if you're trying if you overthink it, you're like, "Well, am
Oh
I
yeah,
unmasking or am I just putting on a slightly different mask?"
am I
Like,
putting a mask over the mask?
yeah, like,
uh,
yeah.
yeah, it feels a bit like you're stuck in a never-ending game of charades.
Mhm.
Well, masking the good, the bad, and the exhausting. It's incredible, isn't it? But it's interesting as talking about are we masking, are we camouflaging? And I have found the camouflaging autistic traits questionnaire developed by, amongst others, one of our bestest friends in autism research, and I wonder who that.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, anyway, it's Simon Baron Cohen. And a whole bunch of other people. But they've come up with this thing called the
Mhm.
camouflaging autistic traits questionnaire, and for once it was developed from autistic adults' experiences of camouflaging, masking, often used interchangeably within the industry, and it's effectively a self-reporting questionnaire to measure those behaviours, and it covers kind of sort of three factors. There's compensation, which is sort of strategies to deal with sort of social or communication difficulties. There's the actual masking, which is, as we've just been talking about, sort of hiding those autistic traits, trying to present a less autistic persona. And there is assimilation, which is fundamentally a strategy for fitting into those social situations, which to me is, again, creating a persona or adopting things from people. It's something I talked about, just going off topic of this thing, with a friend before. Is that do you ever watch a film or read a book and go, oh, I'm now adopting that person's entire personality for the next 6 months. That is now me.
Yeah, it's funny. This is a slightly different thing, but it's something I thought of earlier around masking because a lot of people talk about that sort of thing or of like about like consciously studying films, TV shows, pop culture in order to try and emulate as popular and successful and kind of learn that way. And it's not something I've ever personally identified with
Interesting.
until there was something that came up in conversation the other day. My partner found an article that was basically about how we should all be washing our clothes less for the environment and so on.
Oh right,
And it
okay.
was a survey, and it sort of unearthed a memory which I hadn't thought about for ages. Now, I'm very into music. A lot of my special interests were bands, and I was really into the kind of indie had a big moment around the time I got into secondary school, sort of 2005, 2006, and I
Yeah, I
was
was at
very into
university at
that.
that time. Yeah.
And there was this was also around the time that I started caring about like, oh god, I've got to figure out clothes because my parents aren't doing that anymore and all of that. And there was this song that was everywhere at the time, Same Jeans by The View. To which the refrain goes, I've had the same jeans on for 4 days now. I'm gonna go to a disco in the middle of the town. Everybody's dressing up and dressing down. I'm dressing down. Help
hmm
me providing not just a number, 4 days, but the context of the fact that this was dressing down versus dressing up. So it might be not appropriate to go to the disco in the middle of the town, but if you were just like sitting at home, that would probably be fine. I've used this rough guide to how long a pair of jeans should last depending on the different context of whether you're dressing up or dressing down. Ever since then, and I kind of forgot about it until the other day. And I was just like, oh, there's me being like, oh, I don't really relate to the whole learning from pop culture thing. Oh, here I am using Kyle Faulkner's theory of genes for the rest of my life. So yeah, there's that.
So there you go. We've learned something new about you. So that I'm not going to sit next to you on the train from now on if you don't wash your jeans. It's just terrifying. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, it is. There's lots of these sort of things that you sort of adopt, and I find like pop culture, especially. There's a number of things that I know I do, and somebody has picked out on it at some point and goes, "Oh, did you get that from so and so?" I'm like, "Did I? Oh, I've retconned this out of myself now."
Something my partner has picked up on, which I didn't really know I did, but that I definitely do, is that if we're seeing, different friends or we're meeting different people, I will talk about the same thing in the same way.
Yes.
Like, if I'm talking about a particular topic, I'll almost have a bit of a script, and I guess a bit like one of those toys that you like pull back and it just regurgitates the thing. And I didn't realize I did that until one day last year, where there were a few different friends in London on different days, and then Philip was just like, This is the fourth time I've heard this same conversation that you've had."
You're just playing yourself with a tape recorder in your mind.
I might be a large language model, which is horrifying.
Oh God, you're the one who's programming them all. I don't. I had somebody accuse me the other day of having used an AI to write an email. I went, no, that's just how I write.
Oh god, that's something that we're hearing. It's not something I've had personal experience of, but that is something that we're hearing increasingly in terms of talking about autism in the workplace. Is like, yeah, autistic people being accused of using AI when they're actually just autistic, and it's quite scary. When you consider the fact that, for example, cover letters are increasing for AI, even though you kind of have to write them like a robot to begin with,
Well, yeah.
and yeah, that's a whole thing. Anyway, you were
It's
talking about the cat queue.
Oh, I was, yes. The cat. You know of this already. This is terrifying.
I mean, I know of it. I don't know in detail what's in it.
It's like 25 questions, and it's got things like when I'm interacting with someone, I deliberately copy their body language or
that
facial
one.
expressions.
Yeah. When you do enough autism research surveys, you start to recognize different sets of questions.
Yeah,
It's just like,
exactly.
oh, that one. Yeah, I've done that one.
I've spent time learning social skills from television shows and films, and try to use these in my interactions.
I've
No.
spent time learning social skills from the Vue's first album, and
Washing skills, anyway. I monitor my body language or facial expressions so I can appear relaxed.
yeah,
I'm now going to have some kind of like autistic moment for the rest of the show, thinking, what facial expression? I'm not even on camera, and I'm worried about my facial expressions.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's like whenever anyone mentions eye contact, I'm suddenly like, I have no idea what I normally do with my eyes. What do I do with my eyes? I've forgotten where I put them.
Oh, I either look at their nose or their left ear, or generally I watch their mouth, because then I can actually hear what they're saying.
Yeah.
Which sounds weird when I say it out loud like that, but it's an audio processing thing. I think that's the ADHDs. You can say something to me. I know all the words were there. I heard none of them. They went straight through. They bounced off the sides of the emptiness in my brain. Like, I'm so sorry. Can you say it again? That's what I do. I like looking into people's eyes, and is the intimacy and please don't hurt me. That's it. I have opinions on this. In social situations, I feel like I'm performing rather than being myself.
It is a big mood.
I have to force myself to interact with people when I'm in social situations.
It is also a big mood.
I think this is why our little group of transport nerds gets along so well, because we're all somewhere on the spectrum. Quite nice, actually.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I found with COVID and lockdown and sort of going back home for a while is I hadn't really realized until then how much I had got myself in a bit of a neurodivergent bubble with work and with the flat I was living in at the time. I was
and social
flat
life,
sharing, I was flat sharing in the neurodivergent with another autistic person, and social life, and I I got myself into a bit of a bubble of being able to just be me, and I
Yep.
didn't realize until it was gone,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, that was a
I
trip.
I realised I went and spent some time a couple of years ago. I went to Scotland for a week with some friends from college days, and it took me a good day and a half to recalibrate my brain for hanging around with, for want of a better word, normies.
Hmm.
Like, oh, you won't get that reference. You went on. Oh, what? No, huh? How do I? I know you very well. How can I not be having a conversation with you? I got out of the house to practice. Again, partly of COVID and partly just having found people I got along with and felt safe with. I got out of practice of being able to have social conversations, even with people I know quite well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, back to the Autism Pride Day, and I mean, part of the whole point of it is about raising awareness and making it more possible for people to know about autism. And there was something I wanted to ask you about, because you've been doing a little bit of a project on how easy or difficult it might be for people to get support or help with a diagnosis. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all very much still in train, but essentially, we're trying to get a bit of a snapshot of autism waiting times by region, just because we know it varies quite a lot. NHS England does publish quarterly autism waiting list statistics online, and there's this brilliant dashboard which is really, really helpful in, if nothing else, quantifying the problem, because you can imagine that graph in your head. It is a line and it goes up and it goes up more, and it's
Line
the
must go up.
it's the population of Swindon is currently
Jeez Louise.
I believe it's 183. So this is figures to March 2024. 183,733 people were waiting for an autism diagnosis at that point, which is enough to fill Wembley Stadium twice and still have a few thousand stuck out in a fan zone somewhere.
Yeah.
And most of those are children. So anyway, and you can break all of that down by region as well. That tells us how many people are on the waiting list. It doesn't necessarily tell us how long they've been waiting for. Besides, there's you mentioned earlier, the 13-week guideline,
Yeah.
which nowhere follows.
Nope.
So there is a metric of people waiting more than 13 weeks, which is most of them. Not all, but most of them. And there is a median wait time for the whole of England, but we know there's a lot of regional variation within that. We know that, perhaps more importantly, there's not a lot of support at the end. People tell us that they're sent away with a leaflet, and that was my experience as well.
You got a
Um,
leaflet?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I did actually. I think it might have been a website, but
A defunct
um,
website, no doubt.
but things like that. We know that what we call the conversion rate, which
Mhm.
is the percentage of autism assessments that result in the person getting diagnosed, we know that that varies hugely.
Yes.
So I thought, this is going back in March, this is the previous set of stats.
Mm.
I thought it would be a good idea to send freedom of information requests to all 42 integrated care boards in England, to ask for like a median wait time, amongst other questions around support. And I thought, well, 42 is a lot, but it's mostly the same email. As part of my work, I email a lot of MPs and things anyway in those kinds of numbers. So, it'll be a day's work and it'll be worth it for the information we get out. That was on the 14th of March. We are recording this now on the 18th of June. I am now about 180 FOI requests deep. I have a spreadsheet. I have an incomprehensible spreadsheet full of data and data gaps. I now have a second tab on the spreadsheet with a list of the overdue responses I need to chase up. It's got a little bit out of hand, and yeah, I'm hoping, because we are going to have to, do a cut off date at some point.
Yes.
I'm hoping we'll be able to publish that in some form kind of in the next few months. But, I guess what I would say at this stage is that when we say that it's starting to become the norm to wait years for a diagnosis, that is very much borne out in the data.
Yeah.
And what else I will say is it turns out it's much harder to get this kind of information out of the NHS than I had hoped, in
Hmm.
part because quite a lot of it is outsourced to private providers.
Oh no.
I, you know, well, I don't want to I'm not really in a position to comment on um those assessments. It's not something I have experience with, but it does mean there's a big black hole in terms of FOI being within scope of
Information,
the
yes.
FOI. So
Yeah.
there's a big black hole in information, and increasingly what we're seeing is just a lot of reliance on that, both through the areas that have a direct contract and through NHS right to choose. Essentially, if in England you can, for if you're seeking treatment, which something like an autism assessment is kind of classed as, you have the right to choose any NHS provider.
Yep. Yep.
So
Right.
considering
Right to
that, for
choose.
example, a lot of providers are online,
Hmm.
you can go to your GP, they're willing to refer you. Well, it kind of works two ways. A, a lot of people will now ask for right to choose and to be referred on to usually a private provider because that's the only way to not have to wait years.
Yep.
And secondly, actually, a lot of GPs are proactively taking that initiative themselves and saying, I'm going to refer you to an autism assessment. If you want it within the year, then it will be this way. So, actually, even in those areas that don't have the direct contract, there's a lot of reliance on that, which is a big black hole in the FOI
Yeah.
data,
My
if nothing
my
else.
my GP referred me directly to a private provider, who I have to say actually were very good with me, and they did see me relatively quickly, longer than the NICE guidelines, because I think NICE says 13 weeks.
No
Um,
one is hitting the NICE
no,
guidelines.
no, no,
Like,
no,
I don't want to hold that against them. Well,
no.
I kind of do, but like equally to
I
everything else.
they just by a day hit the NHS 18 weeks guideline for
Okay,
just treatment.
okay, that's also pretty impressive.
Although
Um,
that is partly also because they had a cancellation.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
What I found interesting was that the doctor I spoke to, who was a forensic psychiatrist, psychiatrist. Yes.
mhm.
I said towards the end, it's like, have you ever been referred someone who said they thought they had autism and they didn't have it? And he said, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I have never seen someone who's come to me saying, I think I've got autism, who didn't have autism. He said it's terrible. Lots of people just probably won't be seen because they'll give up because it's just
Yeah,
too hard. He says
absolutely.
nobody is going out of their way to try and find an autism diagnosis. I don't care what they say on TikTok, which I just thought was hilarious coming out of a 60-year-old man's
It's
mouth.
an odd
He says
one. I
it's,
think there's,
uh,
there's like,
there's just not enough people able to do the assessments.
yeah, and I mean, even like there is obviously a funding issue here, like
Yes. Okay.
across
Fine.
the NHS, but also what we're hearing is that there are trusts that they have funded roles and vacancies, but can't get them filled for exactly as you're saying. It's there's not enough people doing them. It will take time to train more, and I guess I think we're coming to the conclusion, and this is very much a live conversation
Mm,
internally, but what is clear is that the current model is not sustainable,
yeah.
essentially, and we're seeing that not just through diagnosis but through EHC.
Support and
Yeah,
yeah.
because there just are more neurodivergent people than
Than we ever
there
suspected.
were than we thought there were 30 years ago. And
Yes.
no amount of restricting diagnosis or disbelief is going to change that.
Hmm.
It might be, I can see us moving towards a future where we aren't necessarily tied to this clinical diagnosis system because autism is not a disorder.
Hmm.
But in the meantime, what do we do? And yeah. Luckily, the government's autism strategy in 2021 committed to developing an autism research action plan in 2022.
Oh, good. Has that come out?
I'm still waiting for it. It must have
Oh,
got lost in the post.
yeah, probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
These sort of
Um,
places, you know.
yeah, it's tricky these days. Things get delayed, things get held up. But yeah, it's we really need to find new models for assessment and support, basically. And part of that is thinking back to kind of the conversation we were having about these things helping everyone. You know, schools and other services and I guess workplaces need to be able to make adjustments based on need rather than waiting for someone to jump through the hoops of a formal label,
Yeah.
which, you know, legally, as things stand, like that should already be the case. It's just not happening. And there are all kinds of like resource issues and attitude issues as to why that isn't happening. But yeah,
But when you have the the population of Swindon or Fort
yeah.
Lauderdale for our Americans waiting for some kind of a help or diagnosis or just somebody
Mhm,
to give them that. By the way, you are right. All of these weird things that well, I say weird things. All the things that you think are weird is
mhm.
just part of who you are as a person.
Yeah, and I guess for
Something's not right.
everyone.
Something's broken somewhere, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And like, I guess what else I would think about is like there are a lot of people obviously on the waiting list, and it is worth noting because there are certain sections of the media that like to focus on, as you say, oh, it's adults diagnosing themselves on TikTok and then going on a wait. First of all, if you're going on a waiting list, you're not diagnosing yourself. If the waiting list takes so long that you form an identity around it in the meantime, that's not your fault.
No.
But also,
Yeah,
like 6 in 10 of that wait list are under 18. There will
it's
be some
incredible.
so there will be some, obviously, particularly the older people within that group might be kind of driving it themselves and saying, "I think I'm autistic." But a lot of them, it's not even that. It's it's parents or other people in the child's life recognizing that there's a need there. That is actually an undercount
Yeah,
because,
massively so.
yeah, so it's an undercount because even amongst those on the diagnosis waiting list, basically the current data set can't capture community pediatrics, which is where very young children are more likely to get assessed and diagnosed. So
Hmm.
that's a known data issue, and that is something that NHS England
Well,
are working on.
that's sort of something we talked about when I covered the fraud around all of the vaccine nonsense. Is that, funnily enough, a lot of kids start showing sort of autistic traits at about the same age you start having them
Mhm.
vaccinated for things, and that tends to be sort of 3 to 5 years old, where you're going to be dealt with in that pediatric area, which does not get counted, like you say, in
Yeah.
those statistics. But also, we know that because autism is an incredibly heritable
Mhm.
condition, that there is something like a 50% chance that if you've got it, one of your parents or certainly one of your grandparents has it. So we might actually be seeing an uptick in people who, once their kids get diagnosed, go, hang on a minute, do I have it?
Absolutely. And I was kind of, yeah, I went off on a bit of a tangent, but if you think about the wait list, for everyone who is waiting for a diagnosis
Yep.
or getting an EHCP or what have you, there are probably 3 or 4 others who are either, as you say, going, oh, hang on a minute, but maybe not pursuing, the formal route, and not everyone needs to or wants to, and that's okay. But there are also people who have no idea they're neurodivergent and are quite happily living their lives. And yeah, there's only so much you can do there. But I think there's also something to be said about the fact that, like, if you have found yourself on a waiting list, because again, nobody's getting an autism diagnosis for fun. So
No, yeah.
if you found yourself on a waiting list, you are there is some kind of difficulty in your life. You are having some kind of struggle. And that is tied into the fact that we basically just don't really have a concept of what a happy, thriving autistic person looks like because it's all very medicalized and very deficit based.
Absolutely,
Um,
yes.
so there are a lot of happy, thriving autistic people who are not touching these statistics because they haven't needed to, and they probably have no idea they're autistic.
Well, yeah, there's a huge number. I say huge number. There's an increasing number of people over like 50 who are
Mhm,
now getting diagnoses of autism, and partly because they grew up at a time where it wasn't properly recognized, and
mhm.
partly just because there wasn't that many people, like you say, showing themselves as being autistic. It wasn't something you wanted to associate yourself with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess access to information in general was
Not as good.
was not as good, but also even going back, I mean, I was diagnosed about 20 years ago, and we had the internet at that point, and my parents were basically told to go away and Google it, and
Yeah.
they came across a long, awful list of, things I'd never be able to do. So going back beyond that, 40, 50 years, we're maybe going a little bit further back here, but we're not a lot far away from the, put them in an institution and forget about them era. We're not we're not too far away from that. And it's worth remembering as well how recent a lot of these concepts are.
Oh yes,
You
absolutely.
talked about, parents and grandparents. My granddad, no longer with us. When I got my diagnosis, or since I got my diagnosis, we are kind of pretty sure he was also on the spectrum. He was actually older than the concept of autism, because autism was first described in sort of the late 30s, early 40s.
Yes.
So of course it was never picked up.
No.
And along a similar vein, the first person to essentially, I guess, as part of study, the first person to receive an autism diagnosis, Donald Triplett, died last year.
Wow.
He had, I can't remember how old he was. He had a good run from the size of things, from the sounds of things, he had a good life. But, you know, the first person ever to be studied when Leo Kanner went, what if there's this thing called autism, was still alive until like last year.
He was
Like,
89 and he was a banker, an American banker.
oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
He
Yeah.
was
So, it's in many ways a very nice story, but it also, when his passing was announced last year, it really made me think about, like my boss says this all the time, but like, we're at the foothills. Where, autism research is very much in its infancy, and of course it has not helped that the like that we as a field spent several decades barking up the wrong tree, looking at causes and cures and whatnot. That help matters,
No, of
because
course not.
now I think it's heading in the right direction. But it's in many ways that's quite exciting.
Yeah,
Like,
very much
our
so.
understanding of this is still very, very primitive, basically, and
Yes.
but it is an area that needs more attention and that needs more investment. If you
Mhm.
look at, I can't remember the exact figures, but Autistic Around Embracing Complexity, how it points on reports on this, kind of where autism research funding is spent, and the priorities of the autistic community,
Are
that
not
don't
aligned.
know. And we're still in this position of like, autistic people and families, they wait years for a diagnosis, in many cases because they feel and hope that it's the gateway to support. And then it's like, here you go, here's a leaflet. And
Or
yeah,
worse, you fall into the kinds of supports that are otherwise known as sort of ABA
mhm.
or PBS, which are functionally conversion therapies for autistic people.
Yeah, I think that's thankfully a little bit less common here than in the US, but certainly still present. And I can sort of understand how families are taken in by that,
Oh,
because there's
absolutely.
nothing else. And I so that there's still this, yeah, there's this huge gap. And there's yeah, I would like to see that. Obviously we're in a period where, as we record this, we're anticipating a general election, and we're thinking
So
about
excited.
asks for the incoming government and so on.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's just an autism research action plan. It sounds boring, but it's kind of critical.
So, Keir Starmer, if you're listening, we're begging you.
Obviously, as a charity, we're impartial. Whoever next government is, it really could be anyone, definitely.
Yep,
Um,
absolutely. The Greens are going to sweep to power. We're going to have nothing but
I don't know who you are, but I'm going to find you and I'm going to ask you for an autism research action plan.
Good. I very much support that because we could do with one. So yes, so it like I say, Autism Pride Day, which was today when we're recording it, but in the past when you're listening. And I think sort of as we sort of wind this up because we've been talking for some time, it's like for me part of the reason why I'm open about my fact that I have autism. I chair a neurodiversity group within my industry, and I talk about it openly with anyone who asks. So I do talks about the bloody thing at festivals. Is to try and normalize it, to try and break through some of that stigma and say, I'm not necessarily saying I'm proud of autism, but I'm proud of the fact that it's made me who I am and given me that ability to do some stuff which I think is good.
Yeah, I think I was lucky. I got diagnosed quite young. So this is something that I've kind of grown up with and have not really ever made any substantial attempt to hide. I think, particularly thinking about my adult life and looking for work and so on, lots of people do feel like they have to mask their autistic traits, and that's understandable given the world that
Oh,
we live in.
100%.
It happens. But I was in a position where, applying for work in the charity sector primarily, a lot of my relevant experience was in autism campaigning. And actually, when I joined Autistica, it was right off the bat of doing some like media stuff. So essentially,
You were already in the right place.
yeah, but also like I didn't have really much of a choice in terms of like, do I share that I'm autistic? And I've kind of put myself in that position and I started seeing it as a bit of a litmus test. The fact that I'm open about being autistic might mean that I may face discrimination, but if they're gonna discriminatory against autistic people, would I have had a good time working there? Probably not. And yeah, I guess there are those ways in which being open can be a bit of a protective factor as well. I've also, as I say, working in such a neurodiverse team, I feel lucky to have learned a lot about autism and neurodiversity from other people, and other people have shown me that I can be open about my needs and my strengths because they've modeled it. And now, especially as a manager myself now, I kind of feel a responsibility to model that for others. I'm not sure I'm always very good at it. But like in theory,
Back to my imposter syndrome.
autism definitely isn't, sometimes when we talk about autistic pride and autism acceptance and so on, I think some people can get quite defensive and
Yes. Oh,
sort of
absolutely.
see that. I think some people read that as like, oh, well, you must not have any difficulties. And that's definitely not true. Being autistic is not, all sunshine and roses, unless you're in the pro summer lobby, in which case it is all sunshine, but not all
I get
roses.
hay fever, so I'm avoiding the roses.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, all roses. But like, no, it's not all sunshine and roses. But it's so, I'm proud of, again, the fact that it's made me who I am. I'm proud of, I guess, being autistic in a neurotypical world and
Yeah.
what I've overcome to get to where I am. And I'm, having an understanding of being autistic in a way that previous generations might not have had means that, yes, there are bits of it that are very difficult, but I know that those same mechanisms, given the right circumstances, can bring me huge joy. Things like intense interest and so on. And that means that, yeah, it helps me to have a more rounded view of my brain rather than purely a negative one.
Have you ever heard of a Greek philosopher called Epictetus?
I don't think I have.
He was a bit of an odd man, but I mean, he was a philosopher, and he compared people who fit in to the white threads of a toga. He said that they were indistinguishable. He wanted to be the purple thread, the small part that you would have that made it bright and makes the rest appear graceful and beautiful. And when his students asked him if he would change himself, he turned around and said, "Well, tell me, if I make myself like the many, how shall I still be purple?" There's nothing wrong with being purple, nothing wrong with standing out a little bit and being different. And I think that's part for me of that whole Autism Pride thing is
Absolutely.
that I'm part of that whole, but I'm still different.
And, I guess we need. It's a cliche, but if everyone was the same, the world would be very boring.
Yeah. Anyway, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on. So thank you so much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
It's thrilling.
It's been really fun.
And I'd love to have you on another time to talk about other things as well. And I feel like we need to discuss the neurodiversity of Doctor Who at some point.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That feels like a mine.
I did. This is a shameless plug. I did a podcast earlier this year with. I was on an episode of Galactic Yo-Yo, which is a Doctor Who podcast. Molly Martian, and I had a great chat with her, ostensibly about is the Doctor autistic, but we went on so many tangents about autism, and like halfway through, we're like, "Oh, we should talk about Doctor Who on the Doctor Who podcast." So yeah, I should probably do the reverse thing where I come on the neurodiversity podcast and talk exclusively about Doctor Who, and then go, "Oh, we should probably talk about neurodiversity."
But yes, if people want more Georgia, where can they find Georgia?
I am at Mind the Flap in most social media places. I don't post as often as I used to, but that's where you can find me. I also have a blog, which is mindtheflap.wordpress.com, where I occasionally write about autism things.
But yes, no, thank you again. Thank you everyone for listening. We hope you enjoyed your Autism Pride Day and have a very pleasant weekend. Take care now. Bye-bye.